Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover what RPE is and how it can apply to hypertrophy training. First, let's explore what exactly RPE means. RPE is an acronym which stands for Rating of Perceived Exertion. The basic concept here is that RPE is used to subjectively quantify effort levels in whatever form of exercise that is being performed. This system uses a numerical scale in which subjects rate their subjective effort. The original RPE scale was between 6 to 20, but it is now more commonly used as a 1 to 10 scale. So trainees essentially rate how hard an exercise bout was, with 1 being extremely easy and 10 being extremely difficult. RPE was originally developed as a very general gauge of how subjects felt during exercise in clinical patients. However, it was then used in more athletic populations as a gauge of perceived effort, particularly for endurance athletes. Typically, it was used as a method to assess the overall difficulty of a training session, to roughly gauge how much the athlete had exerted themselves. For example, after an endurance training session, the athlete would rate that session from 1 to 10 based on how hard they felt it was. However, in more recent years, RPE has been introduced to many other sports and forms of exercise, including resistance training. Furthermore, lifters have tailored this scale specifically for weight training, making it more practical and useful for lifters. The basic concept here is that the same 1 to 10 scale is used to determine proximity to failure for each set. Essentially, an RPE of 10 means that no more reps could have been performed in that set. An RPE of 9 means that 1 more rep could have been performed in that set. An RPE of 8 means that 2 more reps could have been performed, and so on. So this scale provides a subjective method to quantify how close a set is taken to failure. Since this formalization of RPE for resistance training, another similar scale has developed, which is slightly more suitable for lifters. This is the RIR, or Reps in Reserve scale. This works in exactly the same way as RPE, although the scale is simply reversed. So in this case, 0 reps in reserve means that 0 more reps could have been performed in that set. 1 rep in reserve means that 1 more rep could have been performed. 2 reps in reserve means that 2 more reps could have been performed, and so on. So as we can see, this scale is probably a little more practical and straightforward for lifters to implement, as it makes more intuitive sense. However, the basic concept is exactly the same, so lifters may use whichever scale they prefer. Most people watching this video probably like data, formulas, and objectivity, so the entire concept of RPE may be a little intimidating because it is ultimately a subjective assessment, meaning that it is prone to human error. So to see exactly how accurate lifters are at assessing RPE, let's look at what the research says. This study assessed the accuracy of RPE during the front squat and trap bar deadlift exercises in trained lifters. Trainees performed each exercise using 80% 1RM to failure, and were instructed to call out when they thought they were at both a 6 and a 9 RPE in the set. It was found that lifters were very accurate in their predictions, being around 1 rep off their prediction with the 6 RPE rating and less than 1 rep off on their 9 RPE prediction on average. This suggests that in trained lifters, self-rated RPE is a fairly accurate method of assessing proximity to failure. Furthermore, this study used a similar protocol with the back squat. In this study, trainees performed a set of squats to failure using 70% 1RM and were instructed to call out when they were at various different RPEs. In this study, it was found that trainees were actually quite inaccurate in their RPE predictions when they were further from failure, but much more accurate when they were closer to failure. As we can see, trainees were on average 5 reps off their prediction when predicting an RPE of 5, 3 reps off when predicting an RPE of 7, and around 2 reps off when predicting a 9 RPE. However, these inaccuracies may be due to the nature of the protocol. The study reported that trainees performed an average of 16 reps during their set of squats to failure. It is unlikely that most lifters are accustomed to performing a set of 16 reps to failure on back squats, so it may have just been an unfamiliar task for them. So taken together, it seems that if we are familiar with an exercise and are training close to failure, we are likely to be quite accurate in our RPE or RIR assessments which is likely to be the case for the majority of a hypertrophy training routine. It is only when performing a novel exercise or training further from failure that our subjective assessment may be multiple reps off. So now that we understand the concept of RPE and RIR, why should we use it in our training routines? What benefits can it have for us? Well, this is not something that every lifter needs to use. It is simply a tool that can be used if desired and doesn't have to be used all the time. But basically, as we have mentioned, RPE provides a method to quantify and assess proximity to failure. This can be useful to program hypertrophy training by providing a prescription of how close we want to train to failure. This can allow us to quantify this variable, which can impact the training stimulus and the assessment of performance over time. So let's now explore how RPE or RIR can be used in a hypertrophy training routine. As we now understand with recent research, hypertrophy can be achieved across a spectrum of different rep ranges and loads, provided that sets are taken close to failure. This research review concluded that when training anywhere in the approximate 6 to 20 rep range, each set is essentially equally hypertrophic, provided that sets are taken close to failure. So this means that in a hypertrophy training plan, we may not need to prescribe strict reps and loads, rather we can just use RPE or RIR and provide an approximate rep range. Then, the loads used can be auto-regulated, allowing the training program to be more individualized. And then, provided that sets are taken fairly close to failure, each set will be similarly hypertrophic. Furthermore, the exact proximity to failure may need to differ based on the rep ranges and exercises we perform. This research review concluded that heavier loads in the approximate 6 to 12 rep range don't need to be taken as close to failure to maximize muscle growth, while lighter loads in the approximate 12 to 20 rep range probably need to be taken closer to failure to maximize hypertrophy, around the 0 to 2 reps in reserve range. So using RPE or RIR, we can prescribe different proximity to failure ranges based on the specific exercise and the rep ranges we are working with. For example, let's look at this individual hypertrophy training session. As we can see, we have a full body resistance training session with 3 sets for each exercise. Let's now prescribe the rep ranges, load, and proximity to failure. Here we can see that we have implemented rough rep ranges to work in for each exercise. This is because the exact number of reps isn't so important, since hypertrophy can be equally achieved across a spectrum of loading ranges. However, we can see that the rep ranges used are slightly different for each exercise based on the nature of the lift. The heavy free weight compound lifts like the back squat have a lower rep range, while the isolation lifts like bicep curls have a higher rep range. Next, let's implement the proximity to failure, in which we will use reps in reserve. As we can see here, we have implemented an RIR range rather than a strict number, because as we know from the research, RIR is subject to some slight variation. So it isn't really important exactly what RIR is trained with, it is more so an approximate gauge to ensure trainees are training roughly in the appropriate proximity to failure range. We can also see that the heavy compound lifts which are trained with lower rep ranges have been prescribed a slightly further proximity to failure, while isolation lifts trained with higher rep ranges involve a closer proximity to failure. This is because we know that when training with heavier loads, we don't need to train as close to failure to maximize muscle growth, but we do need to train very close to failure to maximize muscle growth with lighter loads. Furthermore, the nature of the exercise may determine the RIR prescribed. It generally makes sense to perform heavy free weight lifts with a further proximity from failure for fatigue management and safety, whereas isolation lifts can be taken to or very close to complete failure safely and with very low overall systemic fatigue. Now let's take this same workout and see how it would actually apply in practice. For this example, we will just use one exercise, but the same concept applies to all other lifts too. So if we look at the dumbbell bench press from this program, we can see that we want to perform 3 sets in the 8 to 12 rep range with around 1 to 2 reps in reserve for each set. So for this example lifter, let's say they use 25 kilo dumbbells. Let's say they get 11 reps on the first set, 10 reps on the second set, and 8 reps on the third set. It is natural for this to occur since the lifter will be slightly more fatigued with each subsequent set. However, as long as each set is taken to the prescribed proximity to failure, the hypertrophic stimulus will still be equivalent. Furthermore, the lifter doesn't have to keep the same load for each set. For example, let's say they perform the same session starting with 27.5 kilos and get 8 reps on their first set. If they keep the same load, they will probably fall out of this rep range, so they can drop the load down to 25 kilos. So let's say with 25 kilos, they perform 10 reps on their second set. Then for the third set, they may drop the load back down again to 22.5 kilos and perform 12 reps. Both of these methods will be similarly effective because all sets are taken 1 to 2 reps from failure, meaning the hypertrophic stimulus will be essentially the same. So what we can see here is that using RPE or RIR allows us to be more flexible with our training routine. As long as we hit the prescribed proximity to failure and work in the rough rep range prescribed, hypertrophy can be achieved using a range of different training methods. This also allows the program to be more individualized to each lifter, since the trainee just needs to abide by the proximity to failure rating and they can use whatever load suits their individual strength levels. So to summarize this video, let's recap how RPE can be used practically in a hypertrophy training routine. RPE is a subjective scale that allows lifters to quantify proximity to failure. For resistance training, the RIR scale has been developed as a slightly more practical tool to use. Trainees can use these scales to prescribe proximity to failure, which can help lifters ensure they are training with an appropriate relative effort for each exercise. This prescription can be used to enhance or to replace the traditional programming methods of prescribing exact reps and loads, allowing training to be slightly more individualized for each lifter. Ultimately, RPE is just a tool that can be used in many different ways. However, it is not a mandatory tool to use, and it should only be implemented if a coach or lifter sees merit and not if it makes the training process more complex. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.